teaching mass mailing techniques using various levels of technology. Since I teach computer software application courses, using a technology is a must every day. However, my challenge is always to inspire my students to see the value of using more advanced computer skills in order to streamline common office tasks and to increase efficiency. Currently, I am teaching an advanced word processing class, and one of the most difficult concepts to teach is mass mailing. With this in mind, I decided to create and to implement a combined lesson plan to present mass mailing concepts to my students, first using minimal technology, then introducing full technology. Ideally, this combined lesson would allow my students to experience and compare firsthand the benefits of using more advanced technology. Before I begin my lesson, I would like to tell you a little about my students. My students are in post-secondary programs. They are working on associate's degrees in either medical assisting or medical office administration. I have 10 students who range in age from 20 years old to 40 years old. Because this is an advanced class, all of my students have taken the required prerequisites, which include Introduction to Computers and Word Processing Application 1, or Basic Word Processing. So they all present average to above average technology skills. I have included a few pictures of my students. The methods I used were actually rather simple. I allowed my students to perform 2 equal mass mailing projects. However, the technology used for each was altered. While performing the projects, each student was required to focus on the following: the ease while completing each project and the time needed to complete each project. Once completed, the students were required to synthesize an opinion of the similarities and differences between the various levels of technology. Based upon my student demographics and the subject matter, I decided to use several instructional strategies to assist with the learning process. My students were asked to identify similarities and differences. They were encouraged to summarize their impressions of the plan and to take notes on the material presented. Cues, questions, and advanced organizers were used to direct discussion. And I also used homework and practice as well as cooperative learning to reinforce the lesson. Although both sections utilize some level of technology, there are many differences in both the technology used for instruction and the technology used for task completion. I have highlighted them here. The minimal technology plan used Microsoft Word. Handouts were given and students were required to use problem-solving skills and previous learning to determine how to complete the first mass mailing project. During this section, there was no instruction provided, nor was there any guidance or assistance offered. Like the minimal plan, the full technology plan also used Microsoft Word. However, there were many differences. In contrast, when teaching the full technology plan, there was instruction provided and a demonstration was used to teach the more advanced skills. Instructor assistance was also available, and students were directed to use either the Office Help System or to use Microsoft.com for additional questions. The procedure I followed involved 3 parts. I started with a few preliminary activities. The lesson started with a pretest. With the pretest, students were asked to share existing knowledge of mass mailing concepts, to identify most effective mass mailing methods, and additionally students were asked to provide their comfort level with completing such a mailing. Once submitted, the pretest questions were used to lead an open-ended discussion about the concepts and procedures for a mass mailing. Part of the discussion focused on how such concepts and procedures can be used outside of the classroom, in medical offices, as well as in personal lives for holiday mailings and invitations. Finally, the students were asked to gather 2 sets of names and addresses using a phone book, Google.com, or YellowPages.com. One set was to be handwritten, and the other set was to be entered and stored in a word table. This activity was meant to serve 2 purposes. First, it was meant to simulate an office setting where addresses for mailings would be stored in either a physical address book or in an electronic database. And second, creating ahead of time would allow for the focus and the timing to be centered around the actual mailing processes for the upcoming projects. Because I wanted to stress the importance of grasping the more advanced technology skills, I found it appropriate to begin with the minimal technology section. For this section, students were given no verbal instruction. Each student was given a series of handouts outlining previous learned skills, such as using a word processor to vertically center a document and to create envelopes and labels, and a handout outlining basic business letter formatting. Then, by way of a handout with no verbal directions, students were asked to create and customize a form letter, also known as Project A, for the 10 individuals on the handwritten list created in the preliminary activity. Independently, each student had to use prior knowledge to determine the most effective way to complete this mass mailing project. Project beginning times and ending times were recorded by each student. Once this project was complete, the students were asked to reflect upon the activity. For Part B, more advanced technology was used for instruction. But before I began instruction, students were given an advanced organizer to help with key concepts and vocabulary terms. Then, to appeal to both the visual learner and the auditory learner, I provided a mix of lecture and demonstration. For the demonstration, I used a projector in Microsoft Word to present a real-time demonstration of the mail merge wizard when using it to create envelopes, labels, and form letters for a mass mailing. Next, I used the projector again, this time with a video. The video outlined techniques for using the mail merge tools, which can be found on the mailing ribbon in Word. Once the demonstration was complete, students were then asked to create a customized form letter, also known as Project B, for the 10 individuals from the saved Word table created in the preliminary activity. Students were required to use either the mail merge wizard or the mail merge tools. Once again, project beginning and ending times were recorded by each student. Once the project was completed, students were again asked to reflect upon this activity. I have included samples of some of the handouts used for my lesson. For the concluding activities, I began with a post-test. The post-test was designed to reflect many of the skills from the pre-test. Now that instruction is complete, students were asked to share knowledge of mass mailing concepts, to identify most effective mass mailing methods, and additionally to now share their comfort level with completing such a mailing. I then concluded the lesson with an open-ended discussion about the various technologies used. I also used a competitive game as a way to review key concepts and procedures. My findings. These findings focus primarily on the comparison in knowledge between the pretest and post-test. When asked about knowledge of the purpose of mass mailing, in the pretest, 70% of my students understood the purpose. And when asked the same question on the post-test, 100% of my students could identify the purpose of a mass mailing. When asked to identify the most effective way to complete a mass mailing, only 10% could identify the mail merge process on the pretest, as opposed to the post-test when 90% identified the mail merge process. When asked about level of comfort in completing a mass mailing, on the pretest 20% of my students were somewhat comfortable. However, on the post-test 80% of my students were very comfortable and 20% of my students were moderately comfortable. Finally, on the pretest, 40% of my students knew the role of the word processor in a mass mailing, as opposed to the 100% who could identify the purpose of the word processor in a mass mailing for the post-test. On the next two slides, I prepared a few additional results to highlight the dislikes and likes my students voiced in concern to the two sections of the lesson plan. I have charted their thoughts on some of the negative aspects. As you can see, the majority of my students were not comfortable with the level of instructional technique used for Part A, and some found Part A to be too time-consuming. I've also charted their thoughts on the more positive aspects. By far, my students preferred the instructional techniques used for Part B, as well as the time involved in completing the project for Part B. These results are fairly consistent with what I had hoped my students would find. One final result involved time. Initially, my students expected a mass mailing project to take approximately 2 hours. When the actual times were averaged, it took 45 minutes to complete the mass mailing project with minimal technology or Project A, and it only took 22 minutes to complete the mass mailing project with full technology or Project B. As a follow-up activity, I asked my students to review their notes and their summaries of the various sections and to synthesize their thoughts into a brief essay. I have included a few of the thoughts shared by my students in their essays. I have also included a list of the resources used, the 2 textbooks I used, as well as the video I used during instruction to show my students the various tools for mail merge. Thank you very much for your time.